Have you ever lost a game because of a bad draw? Or maybe it was the end of a game and you couldn't quite top deck that card you needed? Or you couldn't draw Ice Storm on turn 6 against that aggressive deck that you couldn't hold back? Well, today on Laser Focus, we're going to look at the concepts of consistency and variance so we can try and minimize these problems and make sure that your deck functions the way it's supposed to every game. So what is variance? Well, I think of it as things changing from one game to the next. If you have a set of parameters, say a deck of cards, variance is going to be which cards you draw, when you draw them. It's going to be all those things that can change from one execution of a game plan to the next. By contrast, consistency is going to be doing the same thing every game. It's making sure that your game plan is executed in exactly the way you want it. A perfectly consistent deck would draw the exact same card on the exact same turn every game. In fact, the only perfectly consistent deck would be a deck with one card 50 times, or 75 times if you're a tricolor deck. In short, consistency is the absence of variance. The less variance you have, the more consistent you can be. So, what are some of the sources in variance in card games and in our decks? Well, the big one is going to be draw order. The fact that cards are in a randomized order every game means that we're going to be drawing different cards every time. This is one of those things that's baked into the nature of card games, and it's not going anywhere. Sometimes a game really is just down to draw order and there's nothing you can do. But that's kind of rare. Usually, a game that's lost because of variance, there's something we could have done about it, either in the way we played or in the way we constructed our deck. Next, we have RNG cards. These are going to be your Royal Sages, your Mudcrab Merchants, your Revealing the Unseen. These are cards that generally are included when whatever that spectrum of variance is, every result is acceptable for that deck. So take Royal Sage, for example. We know that there is a set of results that we can get from Royal Sage when it activates. There's going to be a definite amount of keywords that we're going to be able to pick from for each creature on board. Now, RNG is inherently a variant thing. In this case, Royal Sage is no different. It is a very high variance card, or can be. But what matters is that all of the results are going to be good for us. Sure, getting lethal on a 2/1 Crown Quartermaster isn't necessarily as nice as maybe it getting ward in some situations. Maybe sometimes lethal is exactly what we need. The point is, we are getting a net benefit for every keyword that we're getting almost all of the time, except for that 1 in 10 times when your biggest creature gets guard and it has to be killed first. But that's RNG. The reason we include these cards is because from worst case scenario to best case scenario, we are more likely than not to get a benefit from it that we want. Probably the most important factor for your gameplay when it comes to variance and consistency is going to be the way you construct your deck. There are techniques and tips you can use to make your deck a little bit more consistent, or if you're really feeling like it, bake in some variance and go for different experiences from one game to the next. So we're going to take a look at some of those ways you can look at your deck when you're trying to put it together to bake in some consistency and make sure that it can get to its goal and its win condition every time you play. All right, real quick note before we start, there's a lot of super janky math throughout this video. It's more meant to be illustrative than mathematically correct, so feel free to call out my math in the comments, but for the most part, just go with it, take it with a grain of salt, and go with what I'm trying to get at instead of really the raw numbers. Cool? Cool. Let's get into it. If we're going to talk about deck lists, then we need a deck to look at. Today, we're going to look at Abomination Scout, a deck that is, in general, very, very consistent at executing its game plan. Well, what is that game plan? Get Disciple of Namira alongside 2 Thieves Guild fences into the Shadow Lane, and start killing stuff off by filling the lane and overriding that 4th creature with another one. That lets you draw a card that gets discounted, and then you just kind of cycle through your entire deck. Now, this deck's power comes from the fact that it can get to that win condition very, very frequently, and it has ways to ensure that that happens. So we're going to take a look at a couple key points about the way this deck is constructed and see if we can come up with a couple tips and techniques for ourselves to make sure that variance doesn't kill us when we're in game, and make sure that consistency lets us win with our deck's game plan. Step number 1, make sure you have access to all of the effects and all of the tools that your deck is going to want. So that can come in a couple different ways. The first thing is you have to make sure you know what it is that your deck wants. This deck is trying to get to Journey to Sovngarde as quickly as possible, so that means it needs to draw a lot of cards, and that means it has to have a lot of cards in the graveyard for it to recur and get that big old buff onto it. So we've identified that we want draw, and we want creatures that go into the graveyard. Great. So now we need to figure out how we're going to get those effects into our deck. So we could have a couple of them. We have Thieves Guild Recruit, draws a card. Endoro Mastermind, draws a card. Necromancer's Amulet has a benefit from when your creatures die and go to the graveyard. But what makes this deck so consistent in terms of redundant effects is twofold. The first thing is that almost all of the cards that are played as 3-ofs. 3 Dres Spies, 3 Rebuilders, 3 Deepwood Trappers, all the way up to Thieves Guild Fences and Disciples of Numera. That means that each card, instead of having a 2% chance to draw in a 50-card deck, now has a 6% chance to draw at the beginning of the game. And as we go through cards, the odds of drawing any one card gets better and better and better. The fact that we are running as many as possible maximizes our chances of drawing cards that we want quickly. By running 3 copies of Thieves Guild Fence and Disciple of Numera, that means that we have 3 times the chance to draw the effect attached to Thieves Guild Fence, and 3 times the chance to draw the effect attached to Disciple of Numera than if we only ran 1 copy. Just by running as many as we can, we have tripled the redundancy attached to that card. Now, that doesn't mean that we always have to rely on just 1 card to get an effect into our deck. Take draw, for example, in this deck. That's something that is all over the deck. We have Spider Worker, we have Thieves Guild Recruit, we have Endoro Mastermind, among a bunch of other cards that all do one thing: draw cards. That means that instead of just having 3 cards that draw, we have, 15, 18 cards that can help us draw further into our deck? That is a lot of redundancy that we've baked into our deck, and a lot of consistency because we had multiple cards trying to achieve the same function. Think in an Aggro Crusader deck, you run both Orc Clan Captain and 5th Legion Trainer. Both of those have the effect of giving your creatures more attack. That means that instead of having 1 card with that effect, say 1 copy of 5th Legion Trainer only, we now have 6 by including the maximum amount of 2 different cards. We have increased our odds a lot of getting that effect that we want in our deck and making sure that we have access to it by making it more probable that we draw that effect at some point during the game. So why does Abomination Scout run so many draw cards? Well, that brings us to the next point. Draw increases consistency in your deck. Let's say that you draw 1 card, exactly 1 card, and only 1 card on any given turn. That means sticking with a 50-card deck and assuming it's always 50 cards, every turn you have a 2% chance of drawing the card that you want and that you need right now to win the game. Let's say now that instead you drew 2 cards. That means instead of a 2% chance to win the game, you now have a 4% chance to win the game. That logic applies for each additional card that you've drawn, assuming you're looking for 1 card that you need. Now let's expand that to over the course of the entire game, not just 1 turn. Let's say Abomination Scout has drawn 10 cards by a certain turn. That means that there is a 20% chance to have drawn the key combo pieces, Thieves Guild Fence and Disciple of Numera, if you're only running 1 copy. Instead, let's say you drew twice that many cards. That means you have double the chance to have gotten those cards. Running additional draw effects means that you get to see more of the cards in your deck over the course of any given game. And when you can see and pick from those cards, that means you're more and more likely to draw the cards that you need and execute your game plan. The same way that adding in more copies of the same effect is going to increase your consistency, just being able to draw through and get to those cards faster makes your deck more consistent as well. And what's better than drawing a random card from your deck? Point number 3, tutor effects, or drawing a specific card from your deck that you get to choose. The quintessential example of this in Elder Scrolls Legends is Laneth. You play it, you get to pick a card from your deck, put it into your hand. Super, super powerful. This is enforced consistency in one card. For any given situation, you're going to be able to find the card that you need to address that situation because Laneth allows you to draw it directly. That said, just as a general rule, tutor effects in Elder Scrolls Legends tend to be either relatively weak or incredibly expensive. So if you're going to think about including them in your deck, make sure that you can take the tempo loss and make sure that you really actually do need it, and adding in other sources of redundancy wouldn't accomplish the same thing instead. Well, Lazer, I'm running plenty of draw and plenty of redundant effects, but if I get a handful of 3-drops as the aggro deck, then there's nothing I can do. Well, sure, it can definitely feel like that. But what you should probably do is check the curve of your deck. For instance, I've been running a Crusader list this month that's been doing pretty well. However, I have run into a couple situations where I end up with an opening hand that's all 3 and 4 drops, and I don't have the ring, so I'm basically out of the game before it even started. I was talking to one of my friends and teammates in Ozoa about this sort of problem, and being the way better player at this game than I am, he had a really good point. Crusader tends to have a lot of really, really powerful 3-drops, and when I was making my deck, I saw, yeah, these cards are strong, I want to include them. There's a trade-off to be made there between raw power level of including these really strong 3-drops and losing some consistency in having an opening that's strong and powerful and fast because I increased the cost of my cards on average to something that I can't use in my opening hand pretty often. So if you're running into this situation often where you have a whole bunch of aggressive cards but you just can't draw them, or maybe you have a bunch of reactive firebolts and shrieking harpies and ward crafters to keep control of the board, but you're just not quite getting them when you need them, take a look at your curve and put some redundant effects into the low end to make sure that when you mulligan, you're always going to get effects that you're happy to have in the early game. So how does Abomination Scout do on the consistent curve check? Well, its game plan is to reduce cost and then cycle through a ton of them really quickly. That means that it needs to have low-cost cards that it can get onto the board and then get rid of because they've been discounted with Thieves Guild Fence. We have 25 1-drops. That is a lot of redundant costs. That means that on any given draw, we have about half of our deck is going to be something that, if we have the optimal setup, we can slam down into our lane with Namira and the double Thieves Guild Fence, draw something when we sacrifice it, and then keep that chain going over and over because we have so many of these low-cost cards. This concept is known as either critical mass or critical density of an effect, of a cost, or of a color. Critical density means that you have so many of something that you've got enough to reliably have something happen because of that. Probably the best example in Elder Scrolls Legends is the ally cards. Things like Mechanical Ally say that if you have a neutral card on top of your deck, then something happens. The Cunning Ally, if the top card's blue, something happens. Well, how do we make sure that those effects happen more often than not? We get a critical density of that condition. In Cunning Ally's case, we need a critical density of blue cards. If you wanted it to be 100% consistent, then you would have a mono blue deck, or running maybe sorcerer cards because they also have blue in them. You would have every single card in your deck meet the condition of Cunning Ally. Now, most decks can't get away with that, but maybe they can get away with running 35 blue cards and just splashing purple in a sorcerer deck for those big, beefy mid-range creatures. Abomination Scout absolutely has this critical density of low-cost creatures, which allows it to get these redundant costs, reliably draw things that are low cost, and execute its game plan of reducing cost and cycling through them quickly. And if it didn't have this critical density of low-cost creatures, it would be much, much harder for that game plan to be achieved. Now, here's a question. Is variance always a bad thing? Well, not necessarily. There are some cards that you don't want to draw every game. Sometimes they're helpful, and sometimes they're a dead draw. These are called tech cards. They're cards that you choose to put into your deck to serve a very important purpose, but one that won't necessarily go off every single game. Let's look at my Crusader list and look at what the tech cards might be. So first of all, I'm running one copy of Petatus Oculatus Agent. This is arguably a tech card for keywords. If you are seeing a metagame where keywords run rampant, then this card becomes more and more helpful. When I was playing this Crusader list, I was seeing a lot of guards and a lot of wards because I was playing against a lot of sorcerer because it's a very, very popular deck on the ladder right now. So I put in Petatus Oculatus Agent to try and get around those as a pseudo-silence effect. Crusader doesn't have a ton of silences outside of Earthbone Spinners and Halalu Sharpshooters, and this is basically a more aggressive way to silence something. Not only do you not get to have your keywords anymore, I'm going to have them instead. If I was seeing more and more keyword focus in the meta, which is very possible, I might bump this up to 2. Now that said, this is not a card that I want every single game. There are cards that I want every single game, such as the 5th Legion Trainer, the Orc Clan Captain, arguably the Marked Man, these cards that really execute my core gameplay of get cards on the board and deal damage with them. A Petatus Oculatus Agent makes that happen in some situations where there are keywords that are getting in the way. But if I'm playing against another Crusader, then maybe this isn't necessarily that helpful, and if I draw it, then it's just an understated 3-drop. So when you're teching your deck, ask yourself, what effects do I need every single game? Probably make those your 3-ofs. Most games, 2 of is probably fine, and if I just want it every now and again for this niche situation, a 1 or a 2 of, depending on how impactful that situation is, could be appropriate. Now, when you're doing that, make sure you think about how consistently you can get to those answers. If you're running a tech card that's very important, then do you have enough draw to get to it when you need it? Or do you need to put in a second copy, or maybe another card with the same effect, so you can more likely get to that effect when you need it? These are the kind of things that can be really helpful in teching your deck and making sure that it consistently has access to the tools that it needs. So there we go. A brief overview on consistency and variance, how I see it. These are the kinds of things I think about when I'm putting my decks together, and the kinds of things I look at when I'm looking over other people's decks as well. Hopefully you find it useful, and hopefully you can get something out of this next time you're trying to tune one of your decks. And I'd love to hear what you think. Did I miss something? Are these really helpful for you? Leave a comment, tweet at me, or pop by my stream to let me know what you think. Until next time, this has been Lazergician on this edition of Laser Focus. Like and subscribe to the channel for more informational and hopefully fun Elder Scrolls Legends action. And until then, see you next time.